Oh my goodness. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our virtual program. My name is Leland Lazarus, and I am your host. I want to welcome everybody from across the whole Caribbean. And please feel free to tell us where you are tuning in from, whether it be from in the Caribbean or in New York or New Jersey or Canada or elsewhere. And if you haven't already, please like us on Facebook. We're also on Instagram, Twitter, and you can see as well our number on WhatsApp. We keep hearing about 5G technology and the incredible benefits it will bring to businesses both large and small. But we've also heard lots of conspiracy theories surrounding 5G. What specific benefits will it bring to you and your families? What are some of its security concerns? And the million-dollar question, when is it coming to the Caribbean? Joining us to discuss all of these topics and more are incredible guests. We have Emily Delabriere, co-founder of Horizon Advisory and senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Serving as the moderator today is Selwyn Cambridge, founder and executive director of 10 Habitat, a nonprofit helping to nurture Caribbean entrepreneurs to build investor-ready businesses. And so without further ado, I give the floor to you, Selwyn.
Thank you very much, Leland, and good to connect again, Emily. Hope to have a very exciting discussion on this topic. Welcome to all of you who've tuned in to watch this broadcast. I want to say that we at 10 Habitat are incredibly excited to be joining the U.S. Embassy in supporting a discussion around this important topic. As technology transforms industries, commerce, and countries, even the way we communicate and the way we interact with each other, there's been rapid changes in how that is done and how it's supported. And one of the latest changes is the introduction of 5G, which has come with it a tremendous amount of conversation and associated myths. What we're hoping to do is dispel some of those myths around 5G, but also delve deeper into the intrinsic benefits that come with 5G and what it could mean for one, innovation in the Caribbean and the way we do business. So without further ado, I want to begin the first question, Emily, by just asking you to give just a bare bones description of what is 5G for all those who are wondering.
Yes, and thank you for this conversation, and thank you to the Embassy. It's an honor to be here. 5G refers in the broadest sense to the 5th generation of telecommunications. So these are the rules that are going to govern cutting-edge telecoms in this coming decade, the way 4G has for this past decade and 3G did before that. So fundamentally speaking, 5G it's a set of technical standards, it's a set of patents, it's a set of rules that together define how it is that advanced telecoms work. These rules are defined by international organizations, namely by the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU. And those receive input from industry associations, namely 3GPP. Right now, a number of the patents and standards that define 5G are still actually being defined. They're not set yet, but the broad basic contours are, and those technologies are developed. Based on those, 5G is projected to differentiate itself from past generations of telecoms on 3 core vectors: the speed, the capability, and the latency. So speed, that's obvious. 5G is going to be some 20 to 100 times faster than was 4G, which means that the video, the file that takes minutes to download right now would take seconds, and that we might be able to, in this remote work environment, operates much more efficiently and without much of the frustration. The second vector is higher capacity or bandwidth. This refers to the number of users or devices that the network can host. And that's huge right now in a world where, because of technological advances, but also because of the immediate stress brought about by COVID, there are just so many users and so many of their devices that are trying to be on the network, and that can cause overload. 5G's capability could resolve that. 5G could also provide the capability necessary to host the millions of devices and of sensors that together would constitute what we call the Internet of Things. And yeah, sorry.
So Emily, what you've mentioned there is a perfect segue to one of the most, I guess, current and trending myths around 5G, which actually enabled some action around it, which is this whole connection of 5G to COVID and the pandemic. Now, I want us to really delve into the more substantive issues and opportunities around 5G, but let's just deal with some of these misconceived ideas about 5G. Is 5G connected to COVID, and is there any significance about both of them happening around the same time?
No, there's no connection between 5G and the COVID pandemic. And I mean, there happens to be this time correlation where we made big advances in this technology, but one that we've been working on and that really is just a continuation of the past. And then in some kind of a correlated time frame, we hit this major health disaster. And both of them have been wrapped up in geopolitical questions, which has kind of forced them into a conversation that has led to misconceptions. But the real danger is that 5G, this sort of technology, could actually help us to resolve so much of the stress that's brought about by COVID, and that risks being brought about again by similar health crises in the future. And part of that is remote work. 5G can make remote work so much more efficient, so much more seamless, and so much more productive. But 5G could also enable things like connected health, which could bring about better medical and hospital outcomes. So this could be an amazing salve to the current global stressors, and it would be a huge danger to push it aside because of misconceptions.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And also it raises the very important transition that needs to occur, especially as a result of this pandemic, which is proven essential, and that is the need for telehealth. But before we get to that, there are also some really niggling questions I'm sure some of our viewers have, and I've heard this discussion many times before, is the associated health challenges or risk associated with 5G, and the fact that in order to affect 5G requires bigger, more towers, and the radio frequency associated with that. Can you speak a bit to what might be, or if there are any, health risks associated with the implementation of 5G?
I don't think there are any clear health risks associated. Obviously, I mean, construction in any capacity, right? That can create some form of danger, but like that's what we do. That's infrastructure. And we exist in a world of telecommunications regardless. So this is, I mean, it's a very capital intensive process and it's an infrastructure intensive process, but there is no clear connection between 5G and rolling out this technology and negative health outcomes.
Okay, so let's jump into the meat of the matter now, Emily. Let's talk about 5G's real intrinsic benefits. It's been said that 5G is more or less almost 100 times in some instances faster than 4G and LTE. It's also been said that because of 5G, we will be able to do things that today we literally struggle with, especially when it comes to the issue of the Internet of Things. Can you talk about what are the real technological gains that can lead to business improvements because of 5G?
Yeah, so the three core vectors, right? That's the higher speed, the higher bandwidth, and the lower latency. And those together could revolutionize really the way we do business and could create the foundation for massive social change and advance. These aren't differences that are necessarily going to be incredibly obvious in the short term to the user if we're on a 5G network, right? Like you and I will see that our speed, like we're downloading video faster, or it's higher quality, or we're using less battery life, which would be great. Or there are better and more widespread applications of virtual and augmented reality. But the real change that 5G could engender is going to take longer to materialize and is going to exist more in the institutional level, in the sort of technologies that it enables. We have this idea, as you mentioned, of a future world in which everything is interconnected, and therefore that geographical boundaries erased, but also that you can have an Internet of Things. And this is so core to our conception of what we might of like the future we could enter, that you can have a phone activated toaster that talks to your thermostat, or right now we could be interacting in a virtual reality briefing room with avatars that are all phone controlled, or of autonomous vehicles safely and seamlessly moving through smart cities. And this whole idea, right, is built on technologies that already do exist. But the problem is that they have to be scaled and institutionalized and applied. And for that to happen, they need a network on which they can all connect and where they can seamlessly and quickly communicate among each other. And
So
there is what 5G offers.
So I guess bringing it home to the Caribbean, can 5G be instituted on the existing framework and infrastructure that exists within the Caribbean? With some instances, it's 4G and LTE. Can that be done, or is there a need for completely new infrastructure to be installed in order to facilitate 5G?
Yeah, and this is where I'm going to turn the question back on you. But 5G does need so many more base stations than did 4G, because there need to be more and closer together. But right back at you, what is the time frame in the Caribbean?
Yeah, I mean it's and that's been the crux of the challenge when it comes to 5G in the region, right? Because when you look at all of the level of investment that's required to institute 5G and the infrastructure that's necessary, we're talking, I think it's been estimated, and you can correct me here, it's been estimated that the global rollout of 5G is estimated around $8 billion, right? Now, when you look at those numbers and you start to look at, okay, what is it going to effectively cost the region to institute 5G, where traditionally infrastructure was completely borne by telecommunications companies? You're going to now have a situation, I believe, where telecommunication companies are going to require governments to participate in some way of sharing that infrastructure cost. But that presents governments with a dilemma, and that is that a lot of, all of our Caribbean governments are struggling with the effects of a global pandemic. The Caribbean is one of the most, if not the most, tourism-dependent region in the world, and tourism literally ground to a halt. So the coffers of governments are not exactly overflowing. So when you ask the question, okay, how far is 5G? I guess the question really is, how far off are governments from being in a position to literally support the capital cost of instituting 5G? And that question, I really don't know if anyone has the realistic answer to it. But the question I'll have for you is, are we still able as a region to benefit from the implementation of 5G in other jurisdictions where they're able to support technologies that we can leverage in the Caribbean?
I mean, absolutely. And I mean, 5G promises, like, should it actually be institutionalized, right? And as you just said, like, that's the question. 5G promises a potential like revolution in how we do business, and with that, huge opportunities. And opportunities especially for smaller and medium-sized enterprises that are more agile and can like rapidly adjust to new market demands or new market gaps, and also that just don't have that like legacy technology baggage weighing them down. And this is, talking about the moment, right, and talking about COVID stress, this is probably particularly evident or directly relevant to the remote work question, and therefore with it to the Caribbean, as you see people try to take advantage of the moment to move to paradise and work remotely. And the thing is that like 5G could really like transform the idea of remote work and could make it so much more seamless, so much more effective. Take, for example, the idea that all that big file you get could like be downloaded in seconds, or that you could actually have a remote desktop and workplace, or that your video stream would be consistent and quicker. But also like at a next order, the idea of advances in virtual reality that could allow us to have genuinely virtual workplaces with like the virtual water cooler, so that you could be interacting in ways similar to in-person interactions, but remotely from the Caribbean or from here in New York or from anywhere else you are in the world. And this also, COVID stresses aside, could promise businesses the chance to have more flexible models and to have lower costs and to recruit from all over the world. Which then gets to the broader point, and I may have been skirting your question, so this may be more on the nose, about the idea that 5G can really chip away at boundaries, whether those are boundaries that are geographical or are commercial. And that's a huge advantage for either regional entities or commercial entities that can reap outsized benefit from integrating into larger commercial hubs or industrial chains or geographies. So for a small and medium-sized enterprise, it could hugely benefit from filling a new market gap that emerges from 5G. But also for the Caribbean itself, this could provide much easier inter-island and international communication and business operations, whether that's in terms of recruiting or in terms of advertising or in terms of like actual business partnerships.
But so all of that sounds great, and I'm an avid supporter of anything that can drive innovation and technological advances in the Caribbean, in terms of how we do business and how we continue to improve on our processes. But can't much of what is being talked about in relation to 5G be achieved on 4G?
Yeah, only a limited amount of it. Sorry, that was the original question. Yeah, it's a huge challenge, right? And you can say yes, right? You can have a really flashy 5G test site built on 4G architecture, but you're only going to get a fraction of the way. And this is why, even though the technology for 5G is very much there, and it's a proven concept, but for it actually to materialize is much more of a question mark, because you do need this massive, large-scale infrastructure investment, which you just laid out is really, really difficult all over the world. And that needs to happen, and that needs to happen to scale, and that needs to overlap with confluences in technological trends. And that means that there is still a question as to how and when 5G will materialize in terms of its benefits.
How have you seen 5G being used? Actual cases where 5G has been used?
So right now it's used primarily in test sites with some larger scale applications, mostly in Asia. And I mean, that really gets to the point of whether the benefits of 5G are seen, what you see as a user in the short term versus what you see institutionally in the longer term if it's scaled across a system. And so with these test sites, you get really fast operating speeds, and that's great. And you can also have like an actual industrial Internet of Things or an Internet of Things system, but just in a smaller area. But all of this, like the real rewards we reap from this, are when we can do that across an entire geography or across a world or across an entire industrial sector. And that just hasn't been done yet.
What about, and it's even in the absence of 5G in some instances, well, in many instances, now with the institution of 5G in some jurisdictions, and now there being a thrust towards trying to make it as widespread as possible, it means that one, you're making communication access a lot faster, a lot more robust, but also does that sort of opens up the Pandora's box when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yes, absolutely. And because the thing about cybersecurity is anytime you have a new connection, you have a new vulnerability. And so the more we get onto these networks where everything is connected, the more vulnerable our system is. And because we also inherently trust them, right? So we're willing to make ourselves entirely dependent on networks or to share information over networks. And that comes with a fundamental risk.
So would you say then that part of the implementation of 5G should parallel the implementation of certain regulations and policies at the governmental level to ensure the safety and protection of its citizens?
Absolutely. And those policies and those regulations should also be looked at, from an independent government perspective, because as with any public-private partnership, which is what this is going to be, you're going to hear one narrative from the technologists, right, who want to move forward with this with good reason. But it's also, governments do have to sit down and say, what vulnerabilities are we creating? What dependencies are we creating? And this risk extends, it's a question more even just than of cybersecurity. It's also just a dependence on a system. And in the same way that we're dependent on any infrastructure system we create, if we're going to make our entire society or commerce dependent on this network, that has to be something that governments are watching out for.
Great. I want to remind our viewers that we will be taking questions, and I want you to take the opportunity to ask Emily as many of your questions as possible. I'm just a facilitator here. So Emily, one of the things that I want to raise with you is there's been a lot of talk and a lot of work, and specifically in the area that I'm in, which is entrepreneurship development and developing investor-ready ventures, we start to see a thrust towards tech-enabled ventures. And a lot of persons are starting to embrace the concept of AI and Internet of Things, and being able to really fashion complete ecosystems around it and spawn new businesses. What are the specific use cases, would you say, if any, that 5G helps to really push this forward in a meaningful way?
Yeah, there are so many. But the other caveat before I answer this is just anything I say here is going to be the tip of the iceberg, because we're just limited by what we know and by our imagination. So 4G is what let us have the mobile first world and therefore have Uber and Spotify and Airbnb. But it would have been difficult to predict before those happened that they would, or else we would all have created Uber and Spotify. That would have been great. And in the same way, before 5G has actually been rolled out and created the potential innovation that it can create, we're all sitting around guessing as to what the next breakthrough will be. But as you said, one of the key things where there's likely to be massive growth and massive new business opportunity is in Internet of Things innovation. And I mean, there are probably two levels of this, right? There are the whole new use cases that can be formed, all the different analytic systems that you can have, the idea of having an industrial Internet of Things, virtual workshops, even virtual reality. And there's also the new demand for or niches in these systems. So if, for example, you have an legacy industrial player that decides that it's going to have an Internet of Things system to monitor the vehicles in its fleet, it might then need a partner to monitor the analytics that the sensors are collecting and to go about maintenance for that fleet. And so you have one whole new use case, but on the other hand, you also have a demand for what could be a small agile business. Or for example, if virtual and augmented realities really do become widespread and advanced in their applications, those might need designers or maintainers or even data security elements. And we're also likely to see, with the rise of the Internet of Things, not only demand for the literal things that can connect to this, right, like the connected toaster, but also for analytics on all the data that they're going to gather, and then whole new use cases for that data.
Have you seen that in the places where 5G has actually been implemented, that it's been done primarily through public-private partnerships, or is it entirely just private sector driven?
So the idea, and this gets to the whole geopolitical question, which we can get to in a bit, of how 5G is developing in different places, and China is the elephant in the room here. But in areas where it's actually been implemented in a more scaled way, that's public-private partnerships, which is just like the fundamental truism of how you go about building large-scale infrastructure. And it's very rarely based on market forces alone in the private sector's interest to put in the capital necessary to do that, because that's not where you get the immediate reward that the private sector tends to go off of. The technology itself is largely private sector developed, but the applying this with scale is public-private partnerships.
And yes, China being the elephant in the room, I mean, they have led in the implementation and experimentation with 5G. Is there any example you can point to that really demonstrates, this is the impact that 5G is actually having in an actual use case?
It's so hard right now because I just keep going back to that, it hasn't been applied to scale. I think in China, what you would say is industrial Internet of Things systems that are being tested out right now. And so with them, the potential to have better monitoring and pace of operations among autonomous industrial systems.
But it really, certainly from a geopolitical standpoint, it really also opens up this huge, question, which is around what we talked about earlier, which is cybersecurity, but also the control of an entire communications infrastructure, right? With the institution of 5G and the reliance on private entities to really drive its development and implementation, you're literally placing a considerable amount of control in the hands of a few. Does that raise more systemic issues around even democracy?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you framed that question this way, right? Because when we talk about this geopolitical question, what we consistently go back to is, there's a data security risk, right? Or there's a privacy risk from, say, a Chinese 5G system. And that's valid, right? Because Chinese companies do have data sharing obligations with the government, so you might have the systemic information leakage. But as you said, there's a much broader and more extensive and potentially more dangerous threat out there, which is this idea of dependence and control. And China, for example, isn't just building cheap infrastructure for the sake of building cheap infrastructure. The idea is to use that infrastructure to generate influence over the place where it's deployed, and also to lock that place into the set systems that govern it, and therefore to establish effectively control over all the commerce in the industry that's built on this foundational system. And this is tangibly evident in physical infrastructure systems. So for example, when you get a Chinese-built rail system in Africa, and that means that the country is then dependent on Chinese maintenance and expertise and parts and rail cars. And that creates this bind, and then those are also executed by Chinese companies, which means that they garner the economic advantage. And that applies equally, but also probably more extensively to virtual infrastructures, because those are just the foundation for so much more. And they have the potential to be the backbone for all of industry and commerce, which means that all of industry and commerce risks being locked into a system that's set by the controller of the network. And I mean, this isn't, I say China here because China's the elephant in the room, they're the one deploying this infrastructure, but it's really true more broadly. The second you have one player controlling a foundational system, then you rely on them for the maintenance and development of that system, but also they can control the development of things on top of it. And that leads to the question of what's the alternative, right? And I mean, that's where, to my mind, this is something that's very much on the US to take a leadership position and sit down and bring together its allies and its partners and to say, it's not enough to say, no, that's bad, but we have to actually get together and create something else that's affordable and that's safe and that's multilateral, not unilateral, so that there is no one player that has absolute control or on which everybody depends.
And do you see that happening, or are there genuine advancements towards that?
No. I mean, yeah. I'll be a little more optimistic, right? Right now is a recognition that we don't have what we need, and that what's currently filling the gap, which is largely Chinese deployed systems, is not right because that's dangerous. And it risks giving this excessive systemic control. We're getting to the point of recognizing that we need to create an alternative. And I'm saying we as the US here, but really also as like the global system. And that includes Europe, that also includes really all of the world that wants things like 5G, but doesn't see something that is truly reliable. So that's positive, right? Because we're recognizing it. Now we need to go to the next beat and actually do something about it.
So, and this is my last question before we open up for questions from the audience, who I hope has a lot of questions. But I mean, in all real terms, is 5G at that stage where it's this fantastic piece of technology that's been talked about and been researched and experimented with, but potentially is too expensive to be instituted?
It's not too expensive to be instituted. The problem is that it requires governments to be very serious about infrastructure. And infrastructure isn't an exciting thing to get serious about. And it's not sexy. And it's, as you said, expensive, but like this is what governments should be doing, because we as societies rely on infrastructure. And this is going to be a really foundational one that, if executed, at the very least promises connectivity, and if executed the way it probably should be executed, promises massive opportunities and more than worth the investment it takes. So yeah. I think it's a matter not of the money being impossible, but of the resolve needing to be there, and there being the right multilateral rallying around creating an alternative for this that is safe and multilateral and allows systems to maintain their independence.
Yeah, if anything, I mean, what this pandemic has demonstrated is the need for the region to really take a much more serious look at interconnectivity, as well as the embracing of technologies to make many of its operations, whether it's e-government to e-commerce, more widespread. They talk about remote work and welcome visas, and being able to push, the region as this fantastic destination to come to and to remote work. These types of technologies help to make that possible, but also make it a lot more efficient. And I guess the question, and maybe it's not a question for you, but it's an open question, particularly, I guess, would be better placed to governments is what is the trade-off? How do you equate the capital outlay in comparison to the gains, the gains in innovation, the gains in commerce, the gains in industry? Are you seeing 5G as a real catalyst for driving innovation in industries across the board?
Absolutely. And again, at a most basic level, connectivity is. Like, connectivity is the core to driving, you know, innovation and general, like, economic and industrial health right now. And then 5G could really take that one beat farther. But I'd also say that there may be outsized benefits for islands, right? For places that are smaller and can, with better information technology systems, actually be integrated, you know, really entirely into the global industrial and commercial system, which means there could be outsized benefits from this technology.
Right, right. Now, in terms of what has the U.S. been doing, what has been happening on the ground? In your experience, in your research, what have you seen that are really good signs in relation to 5G and its implementation in the U.S.?
The really good signs in the U.S. are the technology that exists, and I mean, the U.S. remains like an innovation hub for 5G relevant technology. Then the downsides are that actually being scaled with infrastructure and there being like a resolved effort to work on setting standards.
Right, right. Are there? I know we've got Leland moderating our online questions. Are there any questions, Leland, that the viewers? Yeah, we can take comments too. While those come through, Emily, if you, outside of the geopolitical risk and concerns, what would you say would be sort of the number one burning question, or if you were to rate your top three concerns when it comes to 5G, what would those three be for you?
I would look at this first from the very strategic level, right? We have a new world order that's being formed, like whether or not we like it. Information technology is emerging. There are new rules. There are new ways of operating. And this is going to rewire the global system. And my main concern is that that risks not happening multilaterally, not happening in a way where we can spread stakeholdership and benefit across the global system, but rather in a way that gives one player or one set of players control. And that would be really dangerous. And that would also be really dangerous for future evolutions in our system, because that kind of monopolistic control risks being self-propelling. And then my second concern is just, infrastructure matters so much. And that's what I keep going back to. And we're using 5G as a proxy for this right now, but there is so much more infrastructure than 5G. There are physical systems, there are other information systems. And 5G risks showing and exacerbating this gap in government's willingness to invest in infrastructures.
Yeah, and so I see there's a question here from Anthea, says that's not enough, Emily. Who are the experts and what research have you to prove there is no health risk with 5G? Do you want to tackle that comment?
Yeah, I would just, I'm going to cite the WHO on this, the World Health Organization, who, and I'll actually just read from their statement on this because I have it here, but quote, "To date and after much research performed, no adverse health effect has been causally linked with exposure to wireless technologies." And that applies to the studies, admittedly only a few have been done, of the frequencies to be used in 5G.
Right. And in terms of, but I guess some of the concerns has been really the density, right? The density of towers that will require the implementation of 5G. And I know that there's been a long touted concern around cellular towers and their connection to health challenges. Uh, have you in your research and working on this subject, have you seen the correlation being made in other ways to the density of 5G towers in order to bring that level of connectivity to communities and potentially the exposure that brings?
So the concerns that I've seen raised have been, and this is whatever sample I've seen, have been less about like the density of towers and more about the frequency of
Right.
5G waves. But what I will keep going back to, and without being omniscient, is that there has been no research that has shown that this has adverse health effects.
Right. In terms of what would your I guess advice to particularly Caribbean governments be when it comes to really ensuring that the necessary attention is placed to the policy frameworks and the regulatory steps taken to ensure that any implementation of connectivity, let alone 5G, reads down to the benefit of the masses and not to the control of individuals?
Yeah, great question. First, I just want to tag on to my earlier answer, which is also like, that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be more research, right? Like, there's no research that proves concerns. We shouldn't just say, okay, we're totally fine. There could be rigorous studies done on something that could have potentially harmful effects, but as of now, no studies have shown harmful effects. So, yes. In terms of governments, right, and making sure that this is something where the benefit is shared, partnerships among governments is probably the first thing I'd go to. Every stakeholder in the Caribbean has a voice and has influence. That influence and that voice compounds if there are partnerships among these governments. And then, therefore, if they can form a united front. Because in many ways, right, this is like a bargaining question. And it's a bargaining question vice the geopolitical system, but also vice the private sector. And that fusion of resources could, not just also in the Caribbean, but more broadly, can not only help you find the necessary research resources and policy resources and regulatory framework ideas, but can also just create a more powerful front against any potential takeover by a single stakeholder.
Right. Oh, here we've got a question. My question is, in light of the dangers of being beholden to a technology provider, given the U.S. propensity to spy on its allies, should the Caribbean be worried about the NSA and USA intelligence apparatus would put backdoors into US-supplied 5G solutions? And given that China has rolled out their 5G before the US, wouldn't their technology be more adapted and advanced for the Caribbean basin? Why should the Caribbean trust one over another?
Yeah, I guess I have two fronts on my answer to this. The first is that, and this goes back to the idea that what we really need is a multilateral solution, right? Where no country and no Caribbean country and no other country is being forced to choose one country, which may be a pipe dream, but that should be the goal of our global system. But then the other front I answer this from is what China's strategy is. And forgive me for diving into this, but I do think it's relevant context. China's global strategy is premised on setting international standards and governing international infrastructures. And in particular, China prioritizes control over international information systems, which obviously means a priority on 5G and telecommunications writ large. In pursuit of that priority, China supports its companies to build at relatively low cost 5G hardware and infrastructure across the world. So yes, that's why this exists. And yes, as that question suggested, that could mean major opportunities for countries, including Caribbean countries, that could therefore be able to develop at relatively low cost 5G infrastructures that have been tested. But the problem is that it also brings major risks. And those are the security risks, because even beyond backdoors that might be built in, there is a regulatory system that binds Chinese companies to data sharing with the Chinese government. And that creates like an institutionalized potential for information leakage. And then, as we've already talked about, like that first order privacy risk aside, there's also just the question of dependence and of the influence over a country that, or an entire economic system that can be claimed by controlling its infrastructure, and also the question of whether that infrastructure in this framework ends up supporting the economies of the local economy and the Caribbean country, or does it end up supporting Chinese players building off of it? And so I think those are the questions to be asking, right? Which is not to say like this is a really bipolar question of great versus not versus terrible, but it's that as one adopts a foundational backbone system, one needs to ask questions about what are the privacy concerns, what dependencies are being built on this, and what degree of the economic benefit that this promises me are actually going to go to my local economy versus going to outside players. And then finally, what strings are attached.
So, but either way, whether it's the U.S. that you lean towards or it's China, there's always an associated risk of leaning solely towards one side and your dependence being beholden to that one entity. So I guess the question that I've got is, what role this international telecommunications bodies play in this?
Yes, exactly. And that's right. That's the question of joining together and having partnerships and having, an actual voice to set the rules. This is what international telecommunications bodies were designed to do. They're designed to make this a multilateral thing in which all stakeholders are represented and in which you can have a system that distributes the benefit across the world and the technological advances across the world. Right now, these international organizations are also a little bit gamed. And that's the challenge, right? Because, forgive me, I'm going back to this, but if it's China that's always setting the standards in the ITU and in the 3GPP, then you end up not having this organization as the buffer between an individual state and the rest of the world, but actually that international organization can create the means through which the individual state projects its influence, which creates a demand for a rethinking of these organizations and also a re-emphasis on their role as multilateral groups of stakeholders, all to be given a voice. Right. And also, that question is also a function in part of the industry associations that feed into them, because if you have one player that organizes all of the industries feeding into this industry association around a certain vision of what should happen, then they end up having an advantage in what's supposed to be a group of independent players. So a lot of the thinking about things like the International Telecommunications Union also has to translate to thinking about 3GPP.
Right. So this is... here we've got a comment or question from Rashid. I would say that one important benefit for Caribbean firms continue to partner with US firms on their tech supply chains is that these firms are much more aware of the US firms, and that key of trust is important for long-term contracts. Which is very true, Rashid. But of course, what we in the Caribbean have always need to be very cognizant of is the need to take very nonpartisan positions on how we go about developing technological infrastructure, and our reliance on one party over the next always still creates the same level of risk, because if that reliance on that single firm or that single country were to pull the plug, then entire industries can collapse as a result. And my concern has always been, the role of nonpartisan organizations, global multilateral organizations, to help stem the possibility or stymie the possibility of those things happening. But like you said, I completely agree. When you've got a situation where many of these organizations are also funded by the countries where it proves almost problematic, and those countries setting the rules, how do you create this level playing field that really you want to see in something as sensitive but also crucial as connectivity?
Yeah. And I mean, again, the answer goes back to scale, right? And to creating and to, finding like-minded partners, or pressuring other players to at least have a conversation, right? And I'm seeing this in questions, but there's this idea that the standards question is just about the US versus China versus the European Union. And those are definitely the big players. But right now, if that's seen as just this battle going on among them, right, that doesn't have implications for other players, then other players only risk getting caught in the crossfire. Whereas if you can have an actual scale association, union conversation among the other players, then you actually create a rival and another voice, and that voice can be heard, and that can actually create the institutional change that means that you're no longer caught in the crossfire. And again, this is a huge ask, and to a significant extent, it's up to the United States to lead and to make this a possibility, which is, my going to turn and say, really Washington needs to do that right now, and to bring back that normative emphasis on multilateralism and real multilateralism, not gamed multilateralism,
right,
so that there can be voices heard.
Right. Yes, I completely agree. I think that if there's one thing that we can do is continue the conversation around the need for more independence and parity across the board in these systems. Now, for small island developing states, when you look at the big players, it behooves the point that we need to start to collaborate more across the board to create blocks of influence that can then be able to help achieve that voice that you're speaking of.
Exactly. And that creates scale.
So we've got a question here. How far off is the US in developing 5G tech?
In terms of the technology itself, not far off. The technology is there. It goes back to the question of whether that's rolled out in infrastructure. And again, I'm going to turn a critical eye to the US and say, US has done a great job of deploying things like 4G across cities. That's not at all the case in more rural areas. So based on there being technology, the US is actually probably quite close and closer than it's expected at having 5G in the hot button rural or urban areas. The next question is the US going to get its act together and apply that more broadly across the country?
And do you know the answer to that?
So in terms of, if you look at rhetoric, there's actually been a new focus on infrastructure from both sides of the aisle over the past at least 2, if not 4 years. And if that rhetoric, if it's translated to action, and based on its consistency and on the clear need for it and political pressures for it, I think it's actually likely that it will. So I'm poised to be much more optimistic about US infrastructure policy in the years ahead. And 5G is such a hyped up subject that that's likely to be one of the priorities. And that is compelling for a number of different stakeholders. So based on the narrative, I'm going to say that this could happen.
Do you see further developments in 4G technology and LTE before the US or other jurisdictions make the plunge into the full adoption and implementation of 5G, considering the associated capital cost for rollout?
Do you mind repeating that?
So the question is, do you see more developments in the area of 4G before this full-scale adoption of 5G?
I think and it's really the question of, right, do you need to build one? It's possible that leapfrog is possible. And that in areas where 4G hasn't been fully rolled out, you actually could just go full steam ahead with a 5G network. So I think the answer is probably very variable on the particular area and what sort of infrastructure they have right now.
Right. Okay. Is 5G, here's another question here, is 5G associated with environmental policy? Is it beneficial or harmful for the environment?
That's a great question. And I mean, it also, there are a lot of levels on which this is a great question, but first of all, because obviously this is how I want to frame everything, environmental policy is itself, that's about infrastructure, right? And so they're associated in great part because it's a similar force. It's the idea of a public-private partnership, because it has to be, that's going to be a long-term capital investment, and that's going to bring about a more desirable system. And that is a necessary thing in terms of advances in technology and also advances in our effect on the planet and a changing world. In terms of the actual relationship more specifically between 5G and energy policy, absolutely there. And in large part because 5G could be the catalyst that allows us to develop and to improve a number of the technologies that are advanced as potential solutions to environmental degradation. So transportation here, or lack of transportation, is a great example. If you can have better and more seamless communication across boundaries, then you don't need to travel as much, which has a great effect. But building more into new use cases, if autonomous vehicle systems and smart cities are going to be enabled by 5G, those also promise to be more energy efficient applications. Or you could look at monitoring, right, and analytics on pollution or energy use. And those are things that, again, in a high density sensor type system could be significantly improved. Similarly with just industrial operations, the idea of having an industrial Internet of Things, and with that autonomy and monitoring and efficiency, those could be phenomenal boons for our environmental footprint. I'm looking now back at China. One of the big focus areas in China right now from a policy perspective is on this idea of new infrastructure. And that we have a new world forming that, as we've talked about, is likely to be an Internet of Things world, and that requires a whole new physical infrastructure, which is 5G, but which is also data centers, and which is also the core components we need for electric vehicle charging and other more energy efficient systems. And I think that framework is actually a really strong analytical one for thinking about the relationship between 5G and environmental technology and progress, which is that these work together in reshaping the foundations for how we go about things, and they can be mutually fulfilling to the extent that 5G can enable new technologies, and then new technologies can also create a world that's more hospitable for innovation.
And what a fantastic note to end on, Emily. I want to thank you tremendously. I want to also extend my thanks to the U.S. Embassy for making this possible. It's important for us to embrace the general notion around technologies is that with the growth and development of technologies comes this inordinate level of responsibility on the part of both governments, policymakers, and citizens to ensure that everyone is protected in that loop. I want to say thank you once again to you, Emily. Thanks for joining us. And to the U.S. Embassy, thanks for giving us the opportunity to host this talk. And to all online, have a fantastic day and best of luck.
Thank you for this conversation, Solon.
Thank you.